Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, let's start with a quick run through the markets for you. Bourses in South Africa and Nigeria absolutely battered today. They closed 2% and 1.5% lower, respectively. In fact, at today's levels, the NSE Nigeria is about 4.5% in the red just so far in 2021. Seplat Petroleum down 10%, roughly 1.6 million shares changing hands there. Airtel Africa shares also down 10% on relatively thin trading volumes. The JSE All Share about 11% higher on a year-to-date basis, but mining majors Anglo American, BHP and Impala, they led the declines today. Impala, in fact, was about 9% lower. That takes it back to levels that we last saw in late February. Further afield, Tesla shares do continue the decline as well, down 4.2% at 1620 GMT. That takes 21% off the firm's market cap. Here's what's coming up tonight. The EU throws its weight behind a push to expand vaccine manufacturing in Africa. We'll explore the details. The airline industry is forecast to hit $48 billion in losses this year as the pandemic continues to weigh on travel. And India's Serum Institute extends a freeze on the export of COVID-19 jabs. All that and more is in the pipeline for you tonight. But let's start with the continent's most industrialized economy, South Africa. The latest inflation data over there indicates that inflation went up to a 14-month high of 4.4% in the month of April from 3.2% in March. According to Stats South Africa, the reading is the highest since a pandemic lockdown was imposed back in April 2020. It falls just short of the midpoint of the central bank's target range of anywhere between 3 to 6% in terms of annual inflation. The increase was driven by higher transport prices. That was up by 10.6% compared to a year ago. Fuel prices also reached the highest level on record. The cost of food and non-alcoholic beverages also went up by 6.3% year on year. South Africa's Monetary Policy Committee is expected to leave the benchmark rate unchanged to 3.5% this week. Governor Lesotho Kganyago said last month that policymakers will continue to maintain an accommodative stance in order to boost economic recovery in South Africa. Now, key data from South Africa also suggests a marginal increase in output, at least in the first quarter of the year, after the economy contracted by the most in a century in 2020 due to the pandemic. Manufacturing and mining production and retail sales all rose slightly in the 3 months through to March compared with the previous quarter. Now, the country was at the so-called virus alert level 3 for part of Q1. The statistics agency is scheduled to publish GDP data for Q1 on the 8th of June, when it will drop the focus on annualized growth and change the base year for the data to 2015 from 2010. After shrinking by 7% as the virus ravaged output and disrupted trade last year, the economy is expected to recover off a relatively low base. The country's finance ministry sees an expansion of just under 4%, but it only estimates that GDP growth will recover to pre-pandemic levels in late 2023. We're still in the broader Southern African region. Zambia is our next focus. Authorities there say they're close to reaching a deal with the International Monetary Fund. Africa's first pandemic-era sovereign defaulter is seeking to reach an agreement of some sort in an economic program with a Washington-based lender. Now, that deal is crucial to the government's plans to restructure as much as $12.7 billion in external debt and to also boost its foreign exchange reserves. Zambia's international reserves were at about $1.2 billion by the end of March, and they are close to record lows. The kwacha has depreciated sharply against the American dollar, making it the second worst performing African currency in the last 12 months. That depreciation has contributed to annual inflation surging to a 5-year high. According to forecasts from the Bank of Zambia, annual inflation will average 21.9% this year and around 16.7% in 2022. Let's turn our attention to more continental matters. The EU has thrown its weight behind a push to expand vaccine manufacturing in Africa. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is expected to support the proposal at the upcoming Global Health Summit in Rome. Now, that support could include direct aid from the EU and funding from national agencies and the European Investment Bank. Now, alongside the funding, Brussels wants to help build up regulatory capacity, including the establishment of an African Medicines Agency, a continent-wide drug regulator that was conceived in 2014, but is yet to get off the ground. The EU is keen to promote initiatives to increase international vaccine production, which it argues is a far better way to improve poor nations' access to COVID-19 vaccines and the patent waivers proposed by the United States earlier this month. Let's explore this story in a bit more detail. Elena Casas joins us now live from London with more. Elena, so the EU Commission President, barely 24 hours ago, she spoke about the need for ramping up production capacity for vaccines worldwide. But what exactly is the plan to do so at a time when many Western economies have been fighting over vaccine deliveries?
Well, the EU feels it has already been doing quite well in terms of delivering vaccines to developing countries. About half the vaccines produced in the EU so far have been exported. So it wants to put pressure on other Western countries, particularly the US, that have not been exporting. So it's calling on all countries to remove their export restrictions and on vaccine producers, the drug makers, to make concrete pledges to supply developing countries at cost. Of course, some of them are already doing that, notably AstraZeneca, which pledged not to make a profit from the vaccine. But others, including Pfizer and Moderna, are making a profit. So the EU is highlighting WTO rules that do already exist that would allow countries to grant manufacturers a license to produce at cost without the consent of the patent holder. So the drug company that has the patent would receive a small payment but wouldn't make a profit.
Indeed, a mandatory licensing in effect there. But she also did speak about helping African economies scale up vaccine production facilities. But I mean, exactly how will this work over the medium term? Because it does take a fair bit of time, money and expertise to put up a vaccine factory.
Absolutely. This was top of the agenda at a summit between European and African leaders that wrapped up in Paris today, where the host, the French President Emmanuel Macron, said he hopes to create a partnership to start producing mRNA vaccines in Africa that could be sealed in the next few weeks. And the summit agreed on a target of vaccinating between 20 and 40% of adults in Africa by the end of the year. But with vaccine deliveries from countries like India, which is of course the key producer for COVAX and has at the moment stopped its exports, really slowing down, it's hard to see how they're going to meet that target. There wasn't any concrete financial promise made at that summit in Paris, even though President Macron did point out that the IMF says Africa is going to need $285 billion in extra funding in order to come past the consequences of the pandemic. And he said he hoped that wealthy countries will donate at least $100 billion of that. But as I say, we didn't get the specific numbers at today's summit. Leaders said we'll have to wait until at least the G7 summit in the middle of June for those concrete promises.
Indeed, the key details missing there. Speaking of the French president, he's in favour, apparently, of waiving patent rights, essentially, on COVID vaccines as one way of speeding up production. But the German chancellor is deeply opposed to that idea. So where does the EU end up standing on this? Or is the EU perhaps as much as an observer as the rest of us are?
Well, it's not just an observer, given that most of these vaccines, like Pfizer-BioNTech's, for example, were developed in the EU with EU public funding. But the EU says the problem is that waiving patents won't be of much practical use in the short term. The companies would also have to share their technical knowledge, and especially, of course, in the case of the mRNA vaccines, the technology involved is very complex. So Angela Merkel's argument is that the limiting factor is production capacity rather than patents, that there aren't enough factories in the world equipped to produce the vaccines. The EU wants to put pressure on drug makers like Pfizer and Moderna to partner with factories in developing countries, but the drug makers have been reluctant to share that technical knowledge because, of course, they want to control the distribution and the pricing. So even if patents were waived, it wouldn't necessarily solve these supply problems.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Elena Casas with the update from London. Thank you. Time now for a run through some company headlines. Let's start in the world of retail. The retail group SPAR expects its half-year earnings to surge by as much as 57%, partly boosted by strong performance in its businesses in Switzerland and Ireland. SPAR says its headline earnings per share is likely to go up by anywhere between 47 to 57% for the 6 months ending in March. Its earnings per share is expected to go up by between 53 to 63%. SPAR is set to release half-year results on the 25th of May. Its shares were about 1.6% lower at the JSE at about $13.43 before the close of the markets. Another retailer, Walmart, raised its annual earnings forecast on Tuesday after delivering better than expected results in Q1. Walmart reported net income of $2.73 billion in the 3 months ending in April. That compares to the $3.99 billion reported a year earlier. Adjusted earnings per share was about $1.69. Analysts were actually expecting a lower figure, $1.21 a share. Total revenue is up 3% to about $138 billion, exceeding expectations and forecasts of about $132 billion. Southwest Airlines says travel demand continues to improve, with booking patterns for next month looking fairly typical, in management's words, as the impact of COVID-19 in the United States wanes. Now, according to the Dallas-based airline, leisure fares next month are getting close to 2019 levels. Southwest expects its May capacity to be up 126 compared to last year, but down 18% compared to 2 years ago. For June, it is forecast to fly 67% more compared with 2020 and 6% less compared to 2019. And finally, the last remaining Debenhams store has closed its doors more than 240 years after the department store started trading. The Debenhams brand will continue to trade online, though, after it was bought out by the fashion retailer Boohoo for about $78 million in January. At its height, there were more than 150 Debenhams stores across the UK, but the chain went into administration in 2019 after several years of declining sales. That's the run through your company headlines. We're about 15 minutes into the hour. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The airline industry is forecast to develop even more losses this year as the pandemic continues to erode air travel. And China and Russia hail nuclear cooperation. We'll look at their latest projects when we return.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Let's focus on the world of aviation. The airline industry collectively is expected to make losses of over $47 billion this year as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to weigh pretty heavily on the industry as a whole. That's according to the latest reports from the International Air Transport Association. Now, government-imposed travel restrictions do continue to dampen the strong underlying demand that the association does see for international travel. Now, despite that grim outlook, industry revenues are expected to go up by 23% to $458 billion compared to $372 billion generated in 2020. But remember, this year's number is just 55% of the over $830 billion in revenue generated before the pandemic. Airlines are expected to make significant losses this year because of challenges in containing new strains of coronavirus. Let's explore this in a bit more detail. Kamil Al-Awadi is the IATA Regional Vice President for Africa and the Middle East. He joins us now live from Amman in Jordan. Kamil, thank you very much for your time this evening. So let's start with a broad overview of the air travel market. According to the latest data from IATA, passenger traffic in March 67% lower worldwide compared to March last year. Cargo traffic, however, has had a very interesting rebound. But those are the global trends. How does passenger traffic and cargo traffic compare in Africa?
Thank you for having me. In terms of passenger demand, African Airlines traffic dropped by about 73% in March compared to what it was 2 years ago, which is also a deterioration from what it was in February this year. So air cargo obviously is improving in Africa, and African Airlines cargo demand in March increased by about 24% compared to the same month in 2019. So it's the strongest cargo recovery in the region. Robust expansion on the Asian-African trade lanes contributed to a strong growth in cargo. But in general, passengers unfortunately has dropped really, by over 73%.
Okay, so you've also made the argument for more support from governments to help their airlines to remain afloat. But wherever you look, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, public balance sheets are really, really constrained. So what kind of support can these governments afford to offer?
Well, you have to understand that prior to the pandemic, aviation contributed to about $63 billion to the GDP of African economies and supported about 7.7 million jobs. Of course, the pandemic has negatively impacted over half of these important economic contributors, specifically about $32 billion in loss to GDP of African states. And it also puts about 5 million jobs at risk. So supporting aviation in general is essential for the African economy. With travel demand down by 76% globally, and let's say 70% for Africa, it's imperative to continue to support the industry financially. We must urgently activate the pledges of over $30 billion made by the African Union, as well as the African and international development institutions to support airlines and the wider industry.
In some countries like Kenya, just to follow up on that particular train of thought, in some countries like Kenya, we're seeing authorities considering giving tax breaks. I know there's a motion working its way through Parliament now to try and exempt Kenya Airways from paying corporate income tax. Are those some of the support measures you'd like to see more of across Africa?
There's many mechanisms that can be put in place by governments to support the aviation industry, whether it's tax or charges or levies, or just giving very low interest loans, whatever the case may be. Any support at this particular time is essential. It doesn't specifically have to be a specific type of financial support.
Okay, so what else needs to be done, though, in standardizing the other things that need to be done in helping people regain their confidence to travel amidst this pandemic, like standardizing COVID PCR tests, quarantine times, tracking and tracing? What are we not doing right in that field?
So we believe there are two specific aspects that need to be focused on. First of all, the harmonization and reduction of border protocols, including the cost of PCR tests. And the second one is the digitalization of traveler health credentials. So if we go to the first one. So harmonization of travel entry and exit requirements across the continent, including the cost and the validity period of the PCR test, is key for the restart of the aviation in Africa. Different protocols across the continent creates traveler confusion and continues to keep passenger traffic depressed. And most passengers don't want to travel because they are very confused on the requirements to leave one state and then enter the next. Also, the cost and types of tests remain restrictive. Okay, so with PCR tests being the standard test required by African states and costing between anything of $30 up to $150 per test across continents. And in some cases, if you want to travel from A to B, you will need a test before departure at A, and you will need a test at B, and you can see the costs going up here. The costs associated with PCR tests place African aviation at a significant disadvantage, and it's a fact. An increase of 10% of travel costs can reduce the demand at continental level by 15%.
Okay,
The
so
other part that we need to, the other part that we need to focus on is digitization of travel health credentials. So today, if we don't put tools in place to manage the COVID-19 testing and vaccine requirements, such as IATA Travel Pass as an example, as more and more governments require verified testing and potentially vaccination proof as conditions of travel, digital health credentials are more secure and efficient at airports specifically than the current paper processes used to manage health requirements. Okay, so we're working with the African Union and the CDC to synergize these digital platforms for travel health credentials and border requirements.
is it part of the problem here that you've got all these different platforms that are dealing with health credentials? Because when I've done tests here, I've seen my details uploaded to a specific database, but then IATA has got its own. I mean, there are all these different databases that exist at the moment, but are they talking to each other?
Absolutely. So this is an issue we're facing right now, where we have a number of requirements to travel from A to B, and it sometimes could be 3 or 4 separate applications downloaded and the same repetitive information being entered at with the same data before you're allowed to travel. And unfortunately, there isn't any interlink or connection between them. And this is why IATA has developed the IATA Travel Pass. It is trying to be a one-stop solution for the digitized requirements of transfer of documentation from one state to another in a very safe and efficient manner.
Okay, one last question for you. I'm trying to look for silver lining here, but given the fact that demand for travel has dropped off so significantly, I mean, this does seem like a prime opportunity to try and lower the barriers to air travel within the continent as a means of spurring the recovery of the aviation sector, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. If you look at the recovery right now, it is very much domestic recovery around the world. And of course, this is not new to IATA, and we are working with the African Union to have the single African air transport market, or SATM. Of course, SATM is a key factor in determining the speed at which the African aviation industry will recover, because then you do have domestic travel, and it means that you have better connectivity and a faster recovery. So far, about 35 African countries have signed up to SATM, representing about 75% of the African passenger traffic. However, only 10 states have fully implemented the SATM measures. Additionally, we're trying to call on governments to reduce these taxes, charges, and other costs that make flying too expensive right now during the COVID.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Kamil Alawadi, IATA Regional Vice President for Africa and the Middle East, thank you for your time. All right, then let's head over to Tunisia. The country's president has called for the cancellation of debts held by poorer countries. He made those comments at a summit on financing African economies at the invitation of the French President Emmanuel Macron. He held that event, of course, starting on Tuesday. African countries are facing an enormous budget financing gap, and the external debt crisis they're facing is becoming a major obstacle to a sustainable economic recovery. Here's Adnan Chachi with this view from Tunisia.
Tunisian President Kais Saied pleaded for the cancellation of the debts of poor countries. He also stressed the importance of the theme of the summit, which reflects the development and economic challenges that the African continent faces, especially due to the spread of COVID-19.
The cancellation of the debts is necessary. African countries are facing a budget financing gap, while the external debt crisis has become a major obstacle to sustainable economic recovery.
The Tunisian head of state announced his country's endorsement of international and regional calls to lift the ban on patents for COVID-19 vaccines. Kais Saied said this move is likely to help all people and countries benefit from these vaccines.
The COVID-19 pandemic shows that Africa is still neglected. Over 1 billion people got inoculated in the world, especially in the north, while only some 20 million vaccines were administered in the impoverished African nations.
President Said met with the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, who is also the African Union Chair, Félix Tshisekedi. He also discussed African economic cooperation with his Senegalese counterpart, Macky Sall. The meetings were held in Paris on the fringes of the participation in the summit on the financing of African economies.
The continent needs different means of financing and loans, which we can repay over long periods, instead of commercial credits with extreme conditions which hinder our development.
French President Emmanuel Macron said his country hopes to reach a political agreement by the G7 and G20 meetings to allow Africa to benefit from nearly $100 billion during the next allocation of special drawing rights of the IMF, while only $33 billion of these reserves are allocated to the continent.
According to the IMF, the economic shock in Africa was felt more dramatically than elsewhere, since the African economy is highly dependent on foreign trade. Experts say Africa's financing needs are estimated at $400 billion. Adan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
The South African petrochemicals giant Sasol has agreed to sell a 30% stake in a natural gas pipeline running from Mozambique to South Africa for roughly $360 million. The money will be used to pay down its debt. As CGTN's Sumitra Naidu now explores, the deal rounds out an accelerated asset sale program that has helped the listed firm reduce its debt load, which had ballooned amid cost overruns at a giant US chemicals project.
Sasol's 30% stake in the South Africa-Mozambique gas pipeline will net $361 million once sold. The sale is part of a program to reduce debt after a tumultuous year in which COVID devastated economies and the oil price plummeted. Sasol will retain 20% of the natural gas pipeline.
These decisions are not about 6 months and 12 months and 24 months. These decisions are about structural trends. Owners of these assets need to re-strategize, restructure the bundle of assets to make sure that the good assets and the bad assets are separated, and so that the weaker assets do not dilute the value of the stronger assets. And it's really this process that globally is at play.
Sasol posted a $5.5 billion loss last year, largely as a result of a massive drop in oil prices and cost overruns at a chemical project in the US. After spending over $12.6 billion on the Lake Charles chemical project, Sasol sold off 50% for $2 billion as part of a joint venture, and it abandoned plans to build a gas-to-liquids plant.
I'm not that confident that these new gas mega projects will get off the ground. I'm sure that there's a long-term future for gas still. It's not going to end tomorrow. But there are existing gas fields all around the world, and the demand for gas, I believe, in the next decades is going to reduce and can be adequately met by the existing gas resources, as opposed to building massive new gas supply.
Sasol will retain full ownership of the project in the US. It will also continue to manage the gas pipeline to South Africa with the ROMCO, the Republic of Mozambique pipeline company. It still has a few more assets to sell off in order to raise at least $6 billion to clear some debt. Reatile Group and African Infrastructure Investment Managers, a subsidiary of Old Mutual, are purchasing the 30% stake from Sasol. The sale, though, will be subject to approval from South Africa's competition body. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
And we're still in South Africa. The country is home to around 11 special economic zones scattered all over the country. But the capacity to make a decisive difference to the country's growth prospects so far hasn't really lived up to expectations. Here's Angela Coppola exploring why.
The government has spent 20 years developing and implementing their special economic zone strategy.
The problem with it is that they have chosen the wrong model of SEZs. Instead of using them as a labor-intensive, export-oriented industrialization tool, they've used them as a regional development tool on capital-intensive industries where South Africa does not have a competitive advantage.
At the moment, South Africa's current proclaimed zones are very similar to the rest of the economy. Essentially, there are publicly financed industrial parks with some subsidized infrastructure and factory or office space.
Employment was one of the key drivers of the policy intervention. It hasn't succeeded. It's estimated that no more than 10,000 people are employed in those 11 zones. The proposal by the Centre for Development and Enterprise, the CDE, aims to change that.
The focus that the government of South Africa should have is labor-intensive industries with minimum amount of capital investment by government in, very expensive, sophisticated zones. It doesn't make sense. What is needed is to give massive amount of jobs to people who don't have jobs. And in essence, the CDE proposal is that.
The proposal calls for an experiment, focused attention on one special economic zone, and that's the Kruger zone in the Eastern Cape.
It would comply with basic health and safety standards, but it would allow individual factories to negotiate with their workers about piecework, about hours of work, and a range of other things. They would pay the national minimum wage, and we are requesting that the expanded tax incentive for first-time workers is expanded to all workers. All products coming out of the zone would be for export only.
What the city is proposing is to make sure that these industries that would locate in what are effectively export processing zones of the old type do not compete with the domestic market, local economy.
It's common cause that the special economic zone policy of government hasn't worked. It's now time for a new plan, and it's got to be enacted quickly. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
That's 18:31 GMT, time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. India's Serum Institute extends a freeze on the export of COVID-19 vaccines. And restaurants in the UK restart indoor services after easing of lockdown restrictions imposed last summer.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are these stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Let's recap some of the stories you're making your headlines tonight. The much anticipated second phase of South Africa's COVID-19 vaccination program is now underway. This expanded drive will focus on healthcare workers, older adults, vulnerable groups, especially as the third wave of the pandemic is setting in. South Africa's cumulative cases now stand at over 1.6 million, with over 55,000 deaths and a 94% recovery rate. Elsewhere, a sudden influx of migrants swimming into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta in North Africa is a serious crisis for Europe amid heightened diplomatic tensions with Morocco. Spain deployed troops to the enclave to patrol the border with Morocco after around 8,000 migrants, many of them from sub-Saharan Africa, and including some 1,500 children, entered the enclave on Monday and Tuesday by swimming in or climbing over the fence. The UN Security Council's meeting later today will also be discussing the post-COVID-19 recovery plan for Africa, a continent that so far has recorded 4.6 million cases. While governments are working hard to curb the spread of the virus, the emergence of new variants and delayed vaccinations is still a key concern. And finally, the French President Emmanuel Macron says he plans to make his first visit to Rwanda at the end of this month. He said his visit will be one of politics and remembrance, and economic operation too. Now, this visit is being seen as a possible breakthrough in relations between the two sides that have been overshadowed by France's perceived role in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. And to run through your headlines. Into the world of crypto. We'll cover this at the end of the program again in an update, but let's focus on the policy side of things. Bitcoin prices have fallen below $40,000 for the first time in 3 months after authorities in China imposed fresh curbs on cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin had already been under pressure from a series of tweets from the Tesla CEO Elon Musk, but the news from China sent it as low as $38,000, $38,514 in fact, at one point in trading. By 0:55 GMT, it had recovered a little bit, $40,600, but still down 5% on the session. The cryptocurrency has fallen nearly 40% from a record high of just under $65,000 that it hit on the 14th of April. It's also heading for its first monthly decline since November 2018. Authorities in Beijing banned financial institutions and payment companies from providing crypto-related services. On the 18th of May, banks and online payment channels will not be able to provide services that involve registration, negotiation, clearing and settlement of digital currencies. The European Union's trade with the rest of the world saw a surge in the month of March. The first quarter also showed signs of a trade recovery in the EU to pre-pandemic levels. Eurostat data shows that the first estimate for the EU's export of goods to non-EU members in March was €195 billion, up over 10% compared to March 2020. Imports stood at €180 billion, up about 20%. China remained the EU's top trade partner in the first quarter, imports and exports both going up by over 20% year on year. The United States came next, with both imports and exports continuing to shrink. The world's largest vaccine manufacturer, that's India's Serum Institute, says it will continue to prioritize India as its key client for the time being, as the country continues to suffer through a devastating wave of COVID-19 infections. Deliveries are now unlikely to resume until at least October. The World Health Organization backed COVAX facilities depending on nearly 1 billion doses of the shot developed by teams at AstraZeneca and Oxford that the Serum Institute is licensed to make. Now, the scheme had originally been expecting its biggest supplier to deliver 110 million doses by May. But India halted exports in March and they started claiming those doses for use domestically as cases in the country exploded. Speaking of India, the country's reported its highest single-day increase in COVID-19 deaths as cases stayed below 300,000 for the third consecutive day. On Wednesday, the Health Ministry data showed at least 4,529 people succumbed to the virus over a 24-hour period as more than 260,000 new cases were registered. India's total case tally is now close to 25.5 million, and the death toll so far is over 283,000. The country's been testing anywhere between 1.5 to 2 million samples a day over the last 7 days, according to government data. The test positivity rate came down from 19.5% last Thursday to 13.3% on Wednesday. Back into China, the country's first homegrown single-dose coronavirus vaccine is now being utilized. Authorities in Shanghai have been administering the single-dose shot against the coronavirus since Tuesday. Clinical trial data suggests that CanSino Biologics' one-dose jab has a 95% efficacy rate in preventing severe cases. Another one of its big advantages is its easy storage. It's now playing a part in China's massive vaccination campaign that has so far administered over 422 million doses. Into the energy business, China's head of state Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin on Wednesday hailed nuclear cooperation between the two neighbors as they virtually attended the groundbreaking ceremony of the largest nuclear energy project to build 4 nuclear power plants in China. Li Jingye explains why this matters.
Located on the coastal city of Lianyungang in East China's Jiangsu province, the Tian-1 nuclear power plant was first constructed in October 1999. Under a 2018 nuclear cooperation agreement between China and Russia, which is their biggest collaboration in the energy sector, Russia's state-run nuclear company Rosatom began construction in March 2021 on the power plant's 7th unit, Construction of the 8th unit will begin in 2022. In northeast China's Liaoning province lies the Xudabu nuclear plant, which is also part of the 2018 deal. Rosatom will supervise construction of Xudabu's 3rd and 4th units beginning this year. The new units of Tianwan and Xudabu will use the 3rd-generation nuclear power technology. Compared with 2nd-generation units, the prevention of accidents is a prerequisite for the design of 3rd-generation nuclear power plants. These new units can also significantly reduce the emission of radioactive materials. Tianwan Units 7 and 8 are expected to be commissioned in 2026 and 2028, while Xudabu's Unit 3 and 4 are scheduled for commercial operation in 2028. The smooth start to the construction of the 4 new power plant units demonstrates the China-Russia cooperation in utilizing high-end equipment manufacturing and technological innovation. It also reflects China's firm determination to achieve the goal of carbon peak in 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060, and its commitment to the world in combating climate change. Li Jingyi, CGTN.
Across England, Wales and most of Scotland, indoor hospitality venues, pubs, restaurants, cafes, they reopened their doors to the public for the first time in months this week after the biggest easing of pandemic restrictions since last summer. But the CGTN's Nicole Johnston now explores they're doing so under the shadow of COVID-19.
It's been a long 5 months for the owners of this London Indian restaurant while they wait for the government to let them reopen again.
Really excited to open and a bit nervous as well.
This is a new restaurant. It was due to open in December last year, the same day the second lockdown was imposed. Now they hope that in a few hours, customers will be back.
I think from last 1 year, everyone is quite worried, myself as well. So at this time, try to stay cool and take whatever comes in front and, work hard and make sure that follow all the guidelines.
After 4 months, life is starting to come back to London's Soho district. But many people are still choosing to eat and drink outdoors. And even inside, there are restrictions. You can only meet up to 6 people and from 2 households. The hospitality industry has lost over $110 billion over the last year, and more than 8,500 hospitality businesses have closed. Now there's a wild card about the variant first identified in India. It's spreading across the UK, and the government says it could delay the next phase of reopening in June. Museums, theatres and cinemas are also reopening, and hotels and holiday accommodation. Outdoor gatherings are allowed, but they're limited to 30 people. England has been locked down 3 times since the pandemic started. Everyone hopes this is the last, especially those in the restaurant trade. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
Portugal is welcoming tourists for the first time in 3 months, but only those from the EU and the UK. Here's CGTN's Mia Alberti looking at how the news is a welcome relief in the country.
The sun is out and the tourists are in. Portugal is reopening its borders for the first time in more than 3 months, allowing the entry of tourists from the UK and the European Union. Visitors only need to present a negative COVID test. A much-needed relief for Silvina Rodrigues and her ice cream business, which she's had for more than 40 years.
Last year was terrible, but this is a relief for me and everyone else. At least we already see people in the streets again.
It's a sweet reward for tourism-reliant businesses like this one, who were shut down for months after Portugal suffered one of the world's worst COVID outbreaks in January. But once the government announced it was welcoming back tourists, bookings across the country exploded. This hotel in Lisbon, which was closed since February, is already seeing a 15-fold increase in demand from what they expected this time of year.
Because we needed vacation, it's locked down. It has been locked down in Switzerland in a certain way. Things are reopening now, but we wanted like a nice place to hang out outside, go to the beach, enjoy the sun and everything. So Lisbon is the perfect location for that.
New clients include Spain, Italy, and Scandinavian countries. However, important markets like the US and Brazil are still left out. But the government hopes the EU will open its external borders soon.
The United States was our fourth biggest market. Now it's eighth. Brazil was fifth. Now it's almost out of our top 10. We don't depend on these markets, but they're very important for us, and we are looking forward to these intergovernmental negotiations.
Numbers are going up, but there's still a long way to recovery.
Last year was catastrophic. It's like we went back 40 years. It will be difficult to compensate for last year's losses in 2021, but tourists are looking for beach destinations and contact with nature, and Portugal has a great advantage internationally.
While the tourists bask in the sun, the Portuguese government is already celebrating the economic recovery they brought with them. In the future, the government hopes it will be able to open its doors further into the world and give another sign of relief for this struggling sector. Mia Alberti, CGTN, in Lisbon.
Now, as his administration continues to push for cleaner, greener forms of energy and transportation, the US president made an unscheduled stop at a Ford electric vehicle plant in Dearborn, Michigan on Tuesday. As Nick Harper now explores, Mr. Biden hopped into the company's new all-electric F-150 truck during the visit, and he took it for a spin. Here's what happened.
Well, President Biden decided to visit perhaps America's most iconic car maker and see one of its most iconic vehicles. He visited the Ford factory in Michigan to see its new electric vehicle that it's working on, the F-150. It will be unveiling a new electrified version of that very soon. Now, President Biden wasn't just there because, by his own admission, he is a car guy. This was all about promoting America's move towards electric vehicles, but also trying to push his massive $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan. He touted this really as something that America needs to create jobs here in the US, but also to be able to compete better on the global stage, and in particular, compete against China.
China has a bigger manufacturing scale than all other countries. And they're using that scale to make these batteries not just in China, but they're making them in Germany and in Mexico. And they're now exporting those electric vehicles around the world with sights on the American market.
He gave several examples of how the United States had slipped on the global stage while China had risen. He said that in recent decades, China has invested much more in research and development technology. He cited one number saying that the US was #1, now it's slipped to 8th place. China was 9th. It is now first in the world. He also said that 80% of the batteries that are used in electric vehicles are manufactured by China. And he said quite simply that needed to change, and therefore the US had to invest more, trying to move the United States away from fossil fuels towards green technology, but also trying to create jobs. But he is still facing opposition from Republicans who balked at this figure, saying it's quite simply too high. Here in Washington, D.C., negotiations have been ongoing on Capitol Hill. We're expecting the Republicans to come out with their counter-proposal. The president spoke about that. He said he does feel that bipartisan support is needed, and by passing the bill, he hoped it would propel the United States further into the 21st century when it came to this green technology. Nick Harper, CGTN, Washington.
US and China cross-border investment has dropped to its lowest level since 2009. That's according to a new report by the National Committee on US-China Relations and the research firm Rhodium Group. This comes as the US Senate on Monday voted to start debating a measure authorizing over $110 billion for tech research over the next 5 years in order to counter China's rise. Roy Rottenberg has the details.
Well, most of the conversation in Congress wasn't about whether or not the act should pass, but rather how the $110 billion should be spent over 5 years. This in light of the perceived growing competition from China. The vast majority of the money earmarked for the research and development of semiconductors and chips. One congressman even suggesting an amendment to include funds for mineral production. Meanwhile, $10 billion are being designated for the creation of regional technology hubs. The act also requiring the creation of a supply chain crisis response program and mandating a national competitiveness strategy. At the core of all this is a sense by many in Washington that Beijing is leading the way in technological innovation in things like 5G and artificial intelligence, or that if it's not doing so yet, it will be soon. The Endless Frontiers Act is part of a U.S. effort to push back on that, but it's also the base for a larger China bill being backed by the Biden administration. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, calling it, quote, a once-in-a-generation investment in American science and American technology. Now, some have questioned the legislative process, asking if the money's approval is being rushed, but opposition has been mostly mute, largely because this is just the latest in a growing bipartisan consensus in Washington on taking a hardline approach to Beijing, and that has some activists worried. One coalition sending a letter to Congress saying the messaging around the act cast the bilateral relationship as a, quote, zero-sum economic and military struggle, which they say it need not be. Rowie Ruttenberg, CGTN in Washington.
Germany's antitrust watchdog has rolled out an investigation into Amazon over the alleged use of anti-competitive practices. The regulator opened the inquiry using a new law which came into effect earlier this year. That law gives it more power to legislate against big tech firms. Ryan Thompson has this report from Frankfurt.
Well, there's no question that Amazon's German site is the biggest online retailer in Germany. It's #1 for e-commerce, and the #2 and #3 sites here in Germany don't even come close to the $11.7 billion in annual sales that they turn over. This is prompting Germany's competition authority to take a deeper dive into Amazon and open an inquiry into potential anti-competitive practices. Andreas Mundt, the head of the Federal Cartel Office, said it's a question of whether Amazon has an almost unchallengeable position of economic power and whether it operates across various markets. If so, they say the regulator would be in a position to take quick action to prohibit anti-competitive practices by Amazon. This could affect a wide range of Amazon services here in Germany: grocery delivery, payment, streaming, in addition to the online retail. In the past, this kind of inquiry wouldn't really be possible without more substance by regulators, but changes to Germany's competition law passed in January now allow watchdogs to intervene earlier in cases against big tech companies. And Germany is not alone in this. France and Spain have both had their own political showdowns with the American retailer over labor issues, privacy, and of course, competition. Brussels is poised to continue to put pressure on the site over how it operates within the European Union when it brings forward big tech regulations in the coming months. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Frankfurt.
A quick run through commodity prices. So gold has been inching back ever so slowly towards $1,900 an ounce from late March. In fact, late March was quite the dip this year. It actually hit $1,683 an ounce. It still hasn't recovered though, recovering all the losses it made earlier in the year. So it's still slightly negative on a year-to-date basis. That might change if this trend continues. The day has been relatively rough for oil as well. Brent fell to as much as $65.33 a barrel before starting to claw back some of those losses. Copper is still among the best performing assets that we track here on a year-to-date basis. In London, 3-month rolling forwards are up 34% so far this year. Here's what's coming up next. When we return, we'll look at how national museums in Uganda are hosting exhibitions to draw visitors back amidst the pandemic.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head over to Uganda. The country's national museum is slowly recovering from all the challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. With a dwindling number of foreign visitors, community-owned museums are now helping to attract Uganda nationals to historical sites, as Leon Sanyange reports tonight on Grassroots.
Artifacts depicting Uganda's beginning, from the Stone Age to the time of its traditional kings. In one of the rooms, a 1908 Ford Model T, first introduced to Uganda by the British colonial government before independence 60 years ago. Just some of the exhibits at Uganda's National Museum.
The exhibitions are targeting the indigenous person, the things we live with, the traditional music, and the traditional monuments that you find around the country. All these are things that describe Uganda as an indigenous community.
In celebrating International Museum Day on 18th May, the museum offered free entry to the public. There have been tough times through the COVID-19 pandemic. Officials here say there have been fewer than 200 visitors in total over the last 7 months. One way museum officials are hoping to entice visitors is by helping them better understand the African culture. These are raw beans and days-old roasted beef, a traditional food from the Toro Kingdom in western Uganda. The kingdom's traditional names and regalia are also on display here. Curator Atwoki Kaganda says community museums created by locals in specific areas are now the repositories for cultural history.
Culture is a missing link in that these children, especially the new generation, are very much taken up by the Western culture other than their own culture, of which their own culture is their identity.
Elsewhere in the capital Kampala, Godfrey Kalule is also creating new experiences for the urban audiences.
We also expect antiques, all the items that, like all the money we have been using since independence, even that money we used before independence, even the cowrie shells, because the cowrie shells acted as the first medium of exchange, especially in Uganda. So someone gets a lesson of all the money we have been using.
30 such community-owned museums now exist in the country. Officials say these museums will preserve Uganda's heritage longer.
It's not that the National Museum can do everything across the country, but a community knows what they value, which we may not value.
The museums, often run by communities, provide a source of revenue. With the growing desire among Ugandans to exhibit their culture, many more are expected to emerge. Leon Sanyange, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
And that story from Uganda takes us into the currencies. So hashtag crypto crash. That's been one of the more interesting trends to follow on Twitter today. Looking at the reactions to the bloodbath we're seeing in crypto assets today, Bitcoin went as low as $30,400, down 13.9% at one point. Ethereum, which was fast approaching $4,200 not too long ago, it went as low as 1961. China's central bank did issue a warning today saying, look, if you're a financial institution, don't accept cryptocurrencies as payment, among other things. So in the eyes of some market watchers, that basically amplified concerns about a crackdown coming through from a country that is home to some pretty significant cryptocurrency miners. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.